Welcome to the Foundation Series, your deep dive into startup compensation with industry leaders from across the startup world. Join me, Matt McFarlane, a people operations leader turned compensation specialist, as we uncover the strategies and practices driving success in tech startups around the world. Hear insights from heads of people, founders, and experts as we explore how to build robust compensation frameworks that not only fuel growth and retention, but do so in the dynamic startup environment that we all know and love. Let's get into it. Adam, so good to have you on the Foundation Series. This has been an episode that I've been looking forward to so much because there's so much alignment between my own interests and virtues around transparency when it comes to compensation. And then OpenOrg is, a company and organization that's just really singing from the same hymn sheet around openness and transparency, but at a much sort of grander level. So welcome to the pod. So excited to have you here.
Well, thanks for having me. We've been fanboying over you from the other side of the world since when we launched OpenOrg, like looking at some of the work you've done previously before doing what you're doing now as well. So yeah, it was awesome to connect properly over a pod and have a chat around comp and transparency and everything else.
Yeah, I appreciate that, mate. For those who aren't familiar with you, maybe some people in my audience, I'd love you to just spend a second telling us a bit about who you are, what you do, a bit about OpenOrg.
Oh yeah, where to start? High level background on me. Interesting foray into like people and culture space. So my background, very high level, is like 14 or so years, mostly spent as founder or co-founder of bootstrapping my own companies since sort of age of 23. So anywhere from 10 employees to 100 as founder, co-founder, mostly wearing the people and ops hat along the way. So I've like built, broken, rebuilt people and culture a few times, and then covering everything that comes with that. So comp's always been a part of that, but obviously everything else along the way as well. And my companies have always been in the talent advisory, people advisory space as well. So along the way, building my own teams. So I've spent years advising, working, supporting startups and scale-ups all over the world. So I've seen how they've done things and seen the weird and the wonderful and the great and the good and the bad and the ugly, everything. So it's been an amazing 15 years seeing all sorts of things. And along the way, have had a really, really good friend, John, who's now my co-founder. And we've chatted for years about wanting to do something together one day, build something together one day. We've always been very aligned on our views on work and culture and everything like that. And we've never had the opportunity to do it. But 2023-ish, the stars aligned. We both were in a position where we were able to think about doing something a bit different and got chatting. And we spotted a really, really, what we thought at the time was an amazing untapped opportunity for companies to embrace transparency as a lever to build healthier companies and healthier company culture. So we started exploring what that might look like and how we could help support people teams, leadership teams to do that. And we got chatting to them, and there was always this running thread there. When you look at problems that businesses face around performance, there's always problems around clarity. The clarity on how we pay people, clarity on how we make decisions, clarity on how we communicate, clarity on like how we use tools, whatever that might be across your business. When things are unclear, people are not aligned, and when people aren't aligned, teams don't perform well. So for us, there was always this running thread there around clarity, transparency, and expectations. And so we started pulling at that thread, and long story short, ended up building OpenOrg. And we've been doing it for about 18 months now, and 18 months later, that sort of problem that we thought we saw is like really, really super clear now that other people are facing that, and it's really felt. So we've built a lot. We've done a lot of different things. We've built dozens of free open source resources, which is a big part of what OpenOrg is about, is trying to get companies to build in the open, do more open things. So that's a big part of our brand. And we've built a lot of open resources and curated a lot as well. That's been, I think, collectively seen almost somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million times by people around the world. This has been like amazing and very unexpected. We've built a paid community on Slack globally for people across startup or scale up, which is unusually capped and almost full now, which is really exciting to see that growing, but that's an incredible space to be part of. We have recently launched a site called Openverse, which is collecting and curating all the amazing open resources around the world for people and culture folks. And we work with people teams as well, with a select small handful of companies to support them on people and culture goals. So we do a few different things across a 2-person team. We're very busy, but we love it, all with the aim of helping to support startups, scale-ups to build better culture, but culture that's more open, more tangible, more transparent.
That's amazing. That's an insane background. And then, yeah, I love, I guess, how you kind of validated. And I really want to jump into understanding like what this imperative you see is from a transparency perspective. I mean, the fact that you had these resources downloaded hundreds of thousands of, to millions of times, I guess just goes to show the appetite for this. And I know personally, within organizations, you're right, like clarity, it gets murky at every kind of step of that employee experience, and a simple one that just came to mind is even just things as simple as language. Like, what do you mean? Like trying to use, buzzwords or acronyms or something like that. And it's just so easy to get lost or caught up in the wrong direction because there's been a simple misunderstanding. So I love that, whole concept about how can we just be more clear? How can we be more simple about what it is we're trying to do or achieve, or the processes we're running through? But tell me a bit more about this kind of sentiment. Again, there's clearly this appetite, given how many times your resources have been viewed and downloaded. But from a general kind of sentiment expectation perspective, like tell me a bit about transparency. How have people's expectations changed or shifted, do you think, towards transparency?
I think people are fed up. It's like, I think that it's always been there. Let's face it, any adult, in the world of work expect some level of transparency. It's people talk about younger generations coming through now demanding transparency, but they don't necessarily want it more than older generations. It's just, we are living in a world now where information is easier to get hold of in all walks of life. So younger generations grow up just expecting to be able to watch whatever they want, see whatever they want, access whatever they want, whenever they want. And that flows into work life as well. So it's definitely becoming more of a conversation piece, but I think people are slowly but surely getting a bit fed up from the point of view that if you go back far enough, even to when I remember being a graduate in my first ever role, there's almost this sort of like feeling of being grateful to be given a job by an employer, which is just mad to think about. But it's not the case anymore, and ever becoming more that. This is like a two-way deal now, and employers rightly expect some level of transparency from employees around what you're doing, how you're doing it, without monitoring and hopefully being too overbearing. There's an expectation there of wanting to make sure that they're getting their value. However, the feeling from a lot of folks is that we're not getting that transparency back from employers. There's a lot of secrecy, vagueness, siloed working, decision-making that happens that we're not part of. And compensation's been a really big part of that from a transparency perspective. I've seen that going back years. My background is more talent than people. So where I've seen it heavily is on the sort of hiring talent, candidate experience side, in recruitment at that sort of very sort of early stages of people joining companies. And it's well documented how bad that is. You put a little post out on LinkedIn if you need to around candidate experience or pay transparency, and you can just see how much people care about it. So big problem. People don't trust employers because of it. And a lot of the lack of trust hinges around pay transparency, and a lot of the issues around performance hinges around other areas of transparency when it comes to expectations and ways of work.
Yeah, I think you hit on some really key points there, and there's a lot of research that I read to your point around the fact that older or more established, people who are more established in their career don't necessarily want any less transparency. It's that they've had a whole career to piece together how this stuff works. And so it's less of an imperative for them because they know that, most companies, if we talk about pay, most companies review their pay at least once a year. They baseline understand the mechanics of how it works and why and things like that. Crucially, back to your point around clarity, is that they've had to piece this together on information that they've gathered from, previous workplaces or others in the industry, different professionals, things like that. So they may not have that understanding 100% whole either. And so by being able to, be transparent, you kind of help just set the record straight, not only for those people who are familiar with those common workplace practices, but those who are coming in and for them, it's their first time and they have greater expectations around it. So it's not that sort of older people don't want transparency, it's that they don't think about it as much because they've had that experience compared to younger people.
Yeah, definitely. It's a challenge for employers. I had it myself. We're only a 2-person team now. We don't have to worry about that necessarily, but certainly had it myself in my previous company. Younger generations, you hire, you see that expectation, but you also see the need to not educate, but to help inform folks. Like, this is actually how it works behind the scenes. These are our workings, rather than just showing them the what. And that's something that sort of fed a lot of my thinking around how companies can help improve in this space.
And you mentioned, in your intro that this isn't your first time building your company. You've employed teams. You've had smaller, larger teams. What role has transparency played for you in those times? Like, what have been the times where you've gotten it right, maybe the times where you've gotten it wrong, that have kind of helped you form this impression that you have now around how we can champion it for organizations and workforces?
Yeah, I'm like weirdly quite sheltered in some respects from this. So I've come at this from like a really lucky position. I've worked for a big corporate for my first 3 years of life as a graduate. Honestly though, it was a good experience. I enjoyed it. I only left because I came up with this crazy idea that I was going to go build a business, make millions and sail off into the sunset, and I didn't. But in the early days, when I literally had a very, very small team of anywhere between one to 3 people, you tend to be fairly default transparent because you're desperate to have someone to talk to and work with and share things with ultimately. So that just is a default thing, and you tend to share whatever you need to share and whatever, helps you grow as a team. In my last business, which like grew really, really quickly post-COVID in that sort of crazy 2021 bubble, that was a really interesting experience. We were default pretty open. And one of the reasons that actually inspired me to do that was I'd spent some time supporting a tech startup who had an open handbook on this thing called Notion, which I'd never heard of at the time, honestly. Like, I'd not really come across it much. And I was like, this is incredible. It's making my life as a recruiter the easiest thing in the world. I can send this to a candidate. They get everything they need. They don't have to do anything on the interviews. Like, they know everything. There's no questions. Well, anyway, this really inspired me. And I said to my co-founder at the time, like, we should have one of these as well. Like, we're starting from scratch here post-COVID, like, let's build this thing. So build a handbook. And again, it was just default transparent because we started from that starting position of getting everything documented and shared. So we had our salary bands on there. We were a small business trying to work it out. I'm not a comp expert either. I've probably improved at it since then, but we didn't necessarily sit there and we didn't do formal benchmarking necessarily or anything like that. We didn't have access to tools. I don't even think some of the tools that are out there now were even around back in 2020. Not the sort of smaller ones that are more easily accessible now anyway. But anyway, default open, and that really helped us. So it just felt very natural to us. However, there were definitely things that made us realize, okay, we've maybe done this wrong, or maybe done this wrong, that were light bulb moments for us. I think the one example that sticks out to me was we probably hit this point where we got 50 to 60 employees and growing, and had this moment where my people lead came to me one day and said, I want to chat to you about this DEI initiative that I want to roll out to the team. And I had to hit pause and say, we can't do this right now. The economy was starting to look a bit tricky. There was some investment involved in it. We just had to hit pause on any sort of spend on anything. And actually that was something that conversation had been rumbling on a little bit for a few weeks. She didn't know that. And that was my fault. So we'd all gone off growing this business, busy building things that we knew were important for long term, but we hadn't sort of come together and aligned on shorter term priorities and goals. And there was this moment of clarity there for me to sort of say, actually, we need to do something about this. We're not clear as a leadership team. We're not aligned. So not compensation, but like this moment of like, this is an error and we need to do better when communicating as a leadership team, so we're not wasting our time. So anyway, you learn these things along the way as you grow and make these mistakes. And that led us to look at implementing our own version of OKRs and trying to pull that sort of that goal setting framework together a little bit. And yeah, great fun, but you make the mistakes along the way as well.
Yeah, and you're right. It's so important to have the context of why things, can or can't happen as an organization, because, I mean, I don't need to tell you, but, what happens to the void of information, or when there is a void of information around why something has been made, is that people tend to insert their own narrative around it. And so the challenges that can come from that when that's wrong, especially on a topic that at the moment in particular is incredibly sensitive around DEI and just, whether or not it's something that the company values as a result of it not taking those steps, or actually the context is completely different and we understand why, we're going in the direction that we are and there's no sort of question about it. I love that from the employer side. I wonder then from the sort of the people side, the candidate side, the employee side of things, what are the big sort of things you see emerging, some of the big drivers around transparency, and, what onus do you think it places on organizations, as we start to sort of lead into a discussion around compensation in particular?
Yeah, and there's links, compensation just links to so many things as well. And again, once you start pulling at that thread, it's like this sort of dominoes effect, isn't it? So one of the biggest places that we spend our time with companies, and again, this is driven by feedback from employees and from people largely, is performance. No one knows how to do it well. No one's confident in like what good performance management looks like, and it's not sadly something you can just copy and paste from other companies either. You've got to find your own version of it that works really well for your business. And so it's very hard to go and then find other inspirational examples out there that you can sort of work from. So that's a really big problem area for companies that employees are really starting to push for more clarity on, is like, how are we being assessed? And how does that inform pay decisions? And how does that inform like growth and development opportunities? And that all is a really big, messy labyrinth of like, what comes first, how do we do it, and that's really, really important. And I think the other thing that I've seen a lot for years already, but again is still rumbling away, is clarity on culture. It's such a vague word to so many companies, but effectively by culture I mean like how we work here. And for years, and it's always been the same, I think, but no one really truly understands how we work here from an external point of view before you join a business. And it's very hard to actually work that out. There's a handful of companies that do this really well, or as best as they could. But generally speaking, clarity around expectations, clarity around how we communicate, how we collaborate, how we do our best work together, when we work, where we work. Companies don't do a very good job at communicating this, and what happens is people join, find a few surprises under the desk, as it were, when they start settling in. Sometimes it's okay, other times it starts grating on you, but before you know it, it's like, okay, I'm going to look for something else. And that problem with like early attrition isn't just a problem for candidates and their careers, it's a big problem for companies, and that's something that isn't going away.
Where do you think that onus within the org lies when it comes to ways of work? Because I reflect again on my own experience, and I think, the best companies that I've worked for who have had this well-defined have been remote companies, because I think they just have to be well-documented and excellent on expectation setting, because otherwise you just have these huge gaps and you can't absorb that, way of working organically in the office, right? So, where do you see that responsibility lying? And, I guess, what are some of the hallmarks of it being done well that you've seen?
Yeah, I fully agree with you. And I think you've had exposure to this as well. Like when we've looked at it, it tends to be remote companies tend to get a better reputation for this, or certainly around how clear it is, because they have to document, they have to make sure information is accessible to people across time zones without waiting for someone else to be online and everything like that. So you design that, and that is our belief, is this can be designed. It's not just something you just leave to happen, and you can leave it to happen, but it'll be a mess. But so our belief is you can design it. Our belief is you should be designing it together to a degree, and co-creating where you can. Like it's everyone's responsibility to live and breathe that. However, our advice is always, it needs to come from the top, not just like, hey, we're going to set the values, but too often we come across companies who are trying to design ways of work around what their employees would like, rather than what their business needs. And as corporate and like business hat as it might sound, everyone's trying to run a business to make it successful. And then if it's not, then they're going to find it very hard to employ people and keep people in jobs. So if you want it to be a success, you've got to work out, what do we need? How do we need to work? And quite often that might involve bringing the employees in to think, like, ideate, to help contribute to what they see as their best ways of working together. So there is a co-creation element, but again, ultimately you have to design it around what the business needs rather than what people want. And there's a bit of a balance, but it's got to be the former first.
How can companies know they're getting that right? What do you see some of either your customers or those in the market doing to say, okay, I think we've got a pretty good handle on this because X, X metric or X thing exists?
Yeah, it's hard because there's so many tiny variables and factors that might contribute to that. You could point to any number of things. Some people might argue that, okay, we know we're doing well because our revenue per employee metric is incredibly high and we're doing incredible stuff with an incredibly lean team. So we must be performing, at a high level. Others will look at employee happiness and feedback and say, right, the team's happy. So we're doing a good job and revenue's okay. Like, it could be better, but like, people are happy and on balance, we enjoy what we're doing. So people will look at slightly different metrics, but it's super interesting. We talk about the happiness thing a lot, and I end up sounding like the Grinch because I sort of make it sound like I don't want people to be happy at work. But we spoke to a CEO at a well-known remote startup scale up a while ago, incredibly healthy company, bootstrapped, profitable, and had said everyone's happy, like we've got a good working culture and everyone's happy, but we're still not performing like we could be. So again, it's this tie to, like, we're focused on trying to make people happy. We assume that that's going to mean we perform, and those two things in our experience don't connect. So we try to get people to steer away from looking at happiness as like a driver of performance and success. That's sort of like a byproduct that should happen if you get everything else right. So hopefully that makes sense anyway.
Yeah, no, I think you're right that there's this you're looking for the overlap in the Venn diagram between the things that your people want and their preferred ways of working. So hence why flexibility, I think, is such a hot topic, right? I think people look at this sort of remote versus in-office debate, and I think I certainly say this a lot on LinkedIn. Like, I think a lot of people are missing the point that it's actually about being able to choose how I work that's going to be most effective for me and therefore for the organization. And I think it's finding those overlaps between what the organization needs and what's going to help it be more successful, because you're right, at the end of the day, we're here to make money, and money in a lot of organizations is a metric for our ability to deliver on the mission. And so it's like, how can you find something that's going to hit both rather than just focusing solely on something that satisfies your people but may not actually be really helpful for the organization and helping it achieve its goals? Sadly,
as an employee, you're ultimately trusting that if we make more money as a business, we'll get paid more, we'll get better benefits, better perks. Sadly, it is reliant on whoever's at the top actually doing the right thing with that extra money and not just pocketing it themselves. So that obviously will happen, and that's not going to be great. But generally speaking, the idea should be, we do better, everyone does better. And there's some great examples of companies that are trying to do that in the right way.
I liked that you were talking about performance earlier in terms of one of the key focus areas. And I know that particularly since that sort of initiation of that, in particular the tech downturn, which is probably the most public sort of, example or showcase of a trend in the market, is around organizations expecting more efficiency, expecting more, performance, more output, things like that. And so performance as it relates to people has naturally just been an important topic for organizations and people teams. When we talk about the role transparency plays in performance, and again, I'm really keen to hear, like, what are companies that are doing this well? What are those traits look like? What are you seeing? What things can our audience replicate within their own organizations that work really effectively to help that be a robust process?
Well, this is a hard one because no one seems to have a good answer for it. I've got views on what's worked well for me before, but I'm very quick to point out to people that was in a very sort of specific context that wouldn't translate well to another company as well. But generally speaking, there's some things that people agree are good traits for what healthy performance like assessment looks like. The one trend, as it were, that people seem to be really keen to keep pushing and exploring, which I think is really great, is trying to take performance assessment away from being like a once a year snapshot to continuous feedback with maybe some slightly more sort of formalized 6 monthly, quarterly check-ins and reviews and stuff. So some companies who have tried to do some cool things around that, like the larger end, got people like Adobe. That's been well documented with them scrapping performance reviews as a really big org to do that. That's quite a big move. And they moved to more of a continuous check-in type approach, which has worked really well for them over the years by the sounds of it. And then you've got companies at a much smaller sort of scale trying to really play on the continuous feedback thing. And that is hard because it's not just a case of building good structure around your performance reviews. It's also about building really good muscle as a team on how to give and receive feedback, which again, no one feels like they do well. Not many people who can comfortably say, yeah, I'm really good at giving feedback or receiving it. So that's something you have to practice. And there's a company called PostHog, which I talk about 5 times a day at least. And most people have probably seen their handbook by now, hopefully. But anyway, they talk about feedback on their handbook and the fact that they get together regularly as a team and they spend that time, everyone practicing feedback together as one team. You can't do that in a big organization, but there's some really cool stuff that people are doing to try and fuel that move towards not really needing formal performance reviews, and ideally always knowing as an employee, where am I now? What's my next step? How do I get there? Am I on track to get there? And then when you do get there, there's no surprises. You know what's coming. It's a bit of a tick box exercise without the fluff of the performance review around it. So anyway, that's like, I think generally speaking, that is an approach that could be adopted by companies of all shapes and sizes. And it's definitely something that people are trying to move towards, but no one really knows how to do it well.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think I love the concept of, ongoing feedback. I think it sounds really nice. I've, certainly in my experience, it's very challenging to implement. I think it's, yes, you have to be someone or you have to be as a team, as an organization, building that capability, that feedback muscle, as you said. And I think it also requires that plus a combination of kind of intentional check-ins. I think there needs to be an intentionality to it. So you're right, like rather than having this kind of once a year intentional check-in where you tend to be sort of, at the whim of recency bias and things like that. It's like, how can I make sure that this is a topic that doesn't get missed through the course of a busy, quarter or month or whatever it might be, mixed in with a sprinkling of just being able to deliver feedback and make that work well. I'm curious about your point around like no formal performance reviews. And I think, again, I'm going to like lead into comp here because I think compensation, in my experience, for companies that have a pretty robust comp practice tends to be quite formulaic, right? Like your performance was X, your pay increase or your bonus or something is Y. How do you find those two concepts working well together, or maybe they don't? Like, what are you seeing in the market or from customers or whatever?
Yeah, I'd caveat what I'm about to say with also the fact that the work we tend to do with companies right now via OpenOrg tends to be what I would class as like startup, scale up. So our sweet spot work we work with some slightly larger orgs here and there, but generally speaking, it's the companies up to maybe 500 employees, something like that. Smaller companies can probably get away, as it were, without having something quite so formulaic, or having something a little bit more personalized in real time. I'll give you an example. Again, previous company, 100 or so employees, we didn't do like one time a year comp reviews pay reviews, performance reviews, everyone had their own goals that they were working towards. And when they achieved those goals, they're promoted or they got their pay rise, which I know is messy in a larger organization. Anyone who worked in a compensation team is probably like sweating at this, but like it was fine for us at the level and the size we were at. Like we were in this place where any given month, you might have a couple of people who are given a pay rise or a promotion, and they've been given that when they've earned it, rather than actually earning it 5 months before and having to wait 5 months to finally get that pay rise or that review or whatever. So I'm a big fan of that. It won't work in every company, and I know that. But I think that's where you can decouple it a little bit. And it works incredibly well for us because you're able to say to people, right, you set your goals and you're incredibly clear on what you need to do, how you need to do it. We put a lot of focus on making sure those goals are as tangible and black and white as possible so that there was no gut feel around that performance process. And it was all about you. So there wasn't a big pot of money at the end of the year. We didn't have to sit there and work out how that was going to be spread and spent across the team. I know that's a big thing probably for larger companies, I would say. It's trying to work out how do we use a pot of money to compensate certain performers. Whoever performs got rewarded, and that worked really well in a small company, but I know that doesn't in a large company. So you do need everything you've just said. You will need to sort of have something a little bit more formal, I would suggest.
Yeah. But I guess the key points and the traits that I'm hearing is that people understood what that North Star was for them, and they understood what was at the other end of it, and they kind of, it was all very clear. It was all very straightforward. There was no kind of guessing. There was no uncertainty as sort of the key traits to look at, canvassing or incorporating within those practices and how they relate.
I think that I get one of the big headaches with performance when we speak to companies, it's all around that calibration piece and trying to also then work out like who gets a slice of what pie at the end. How do we, and that's where people are often scratching their heads and unhappy because it's not about who doesn't get that pay rise. It's about how can you show me the data or the workings out so that I know why Matt and that team got a pay rise, but I didn't, because in my view, that all those conversations that happen underneath, companies can't answer that because there's nothing really solid that they can share. And if there is, they're not prepared to share it. So
yeah, great points. I think that's a really good segue into just pay transparency in general as a topic, which is where I'd love to spend a bit of time now. But maybe let's start like what, I meet people all the time that have different ideas of what pay transparency is. I'd love to start with, your understanding of it, help us understand as an audience, or at least make sure we're talking about the same thing, speaking about clarity. But what's pay transparency from your perspective?
I had two answers here, which I think sort of maybe guide what you do as a business. One is like your personal definition as a founder or a CEO or whoever's making that decision. Like you're going to have your own personal compass, I think, that defines what you think pay transparency is. For some people, like let's use a classic example, Buffer. Clearly, pay transparency to them is being incredibly open and sharing my salary as a CEO and everyone else's, etc. Others will be a little bit more closed, and that's okay. Like it doesn't have to be a problem. But the other answer is also it's dependent on the laws, the regulations, as a minimum bar for the place you're in. UK has very little in place around specific pay, and obviously we know globally that there's all sorts of laws and regulations coming in. So in theory, definition of pay transparency is whatever is in place legally in your country. You've got to abide by that, and that is, whatever that might be, whether you're in the EU or the US or wherever. But then I think on top of that, you layer on the personal belief. So you've got this opportunity to level that up and say, actually, you know what, we could meet this, but actually, I believe we should do this, and that's where it becomes a little bit trickier.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think there's definitely, and then this is where I, work or discuss a lot with people and startups is, transparency is that kind of two-tiered approach. It's what you're legally required to do on the pay transparency front is that sort of minimum, that floor. And then it's what's actually going to work best for us as an organization. To what degree do we want to be transparent about pay? And I think that's a really critical point, because so often I hear people go, "Oh, pay transparency. We wouldn't, we couldn't possibly have that where everybody knows everybody else's salary." And it's like, well, it doesn't have to be that. It can be, the step before that, where just the individual knows what their salary should be as, determined by the company. So it's really this spectrum. It's really, like you said, this kind of context of what's the legislative environment, what's the cultural environment, the strategic environment, those sorts of things that help you kind of land on your position. But I also think there's a lot that needs to go into taking steps to actually be transparent on pay. And I guess I see that sort of initial frontier as being fundamentally, you can say that you're transparent about pay if you share with an individual what you value their role at. And that individual could be a candidate outside the business. It could be someone who's occupying the role at the moment, but they fundamentally understand that you value their role at X, Y, or a range. But what do you think are some of the conditions that companies need to have in place to take a step like that? Because it's really not as simple as switching on a tap, is it?
Well, I think also what some people do get hung up on, and I know this will sound easier than it is. I'm not trying to suggest that it's easy, but people sometimes, I think, confuse transparency with perfection. Being transparent doesn't mean you have to be perfect or have to do everything well. So my view is always like, share what you do. If you can't afford to pay for all the fancy benchmarking tools and platforms and data because you're a really small startup, there's still things you can do to be better than doing nothing. There's free data and sources out there, and we know they're not going to be perfect, but you look at enough of them, pull together an average, it's not going to be perfect. But if you show people you're working, give them a good solid feel for what you do to try and go through that process, then that's a lot better than nothing. And that is received so much better than not sharing a thing. So again, I always try and sort of say people, try not to get too sucked into the idea of perfection when it comes to pay transparency, because people don't necessarily, it's important, but you can only do what you can do. I think in terms of some of the key groundwork that needs to be in place, and there's got to be some data you can point back to, or some process you can point to say, this is how I've worked out this salary or salary band for this role. And there's no excuses for not having something in place there. And I reference this a lot as a recruiter who's worked on both sides of the fence, and a business owner who's hired for their own team. Like, there's always a budget. There's always a figure that you talk about when you're hiring that you get from somewhere. There's never an excuse not to talk to that to a candidate about that. So whenever companies say like we don't have a figure, like there's always one. There's always something there. So anyway, having some basic like foundations in place from a data point of view, like really important. Having, if the laws that you're working to require you to share something on a job advert, you've got to make sure you've got the right things in place so that when you do share that, your internal team members aren't going to get a shock and complain. And so it's a case of trying to work out like, okay, if all of this was leaked tomorrow, what would the reception be from our employees? And you sort of build back from there and work out what you need to have in place to make sure you're comfortable that you can then go and share it.
Yeah, I think that's so critical. And there's a few people I've spoken to who have this test that they call the printer test, which is probably less relevant in today's environment. I don't know how many places have a printer anymore, but if someone were to pick up a sheet of paper with everybody's salary on it, would you be embarrassed? Wouldn't you? Could you explain it? Could you, help people understand why someone's paid X and somebody else is paid Y? Like, if that logic is there, that's really the first step in building trust with your people, is just documenting that and helping them understand. And it's so often it's I have a similar conversation with people. So often it's just about, dot pointing the stuff that you already do. Don't worry about, trying to be too strategic about it and things like that. I think that's important by all means, but that first step is going, hey, we review pay once a year if that's what you do. And it tends to be, this time of year, and here's the basis upon which we evaluate it. Like, just giving people that sense of understanding is incredible for building trust and giving them a concept and an understanding around how you view pay and what's important to the business. But it also takes a real lot off your plate from a people team, because you get these questions anyway. And I think increasingly so, as you mentioned, because these younger generations are coming in, and, Gen Z have that expectation, and you better be able to, explain and stand by what it is that you're paying, because they have the expectation, and they're not afraid to dump an employer if they don't feel like they've given a good enough rationale for why they've chosen that number. So it's a very changing dynamic, but I also think, as you mentioned, that bar is pretty low, and it's not hard to get started. You don't have to boil the ocean, and I think you just have to do it knowing that you need to be prepared to have a conversation about it, because people will challenge it, invariably, and I think you just need to be prepared to defend it, and you need to be prepared to change it if you actually realize that you don't have a coherent reason for why you do a certain thing that you do.
Yeah, it's again, I use my last company as an example. We had transparent salary bands on our handbook. It was a simple model that we had in terms of like the type of business we had. So 90% of our employees were in one function, as it were. Made it a lot easier for us to do this. But we didn't have access to platforms, data. Our data was like sourced for free by us, by looking at competitors and everyone else in our industry. So we had a really good understanding of where we sat. We couldn't necessarily say to someone, we pay X percentile, but based on market rate, etc. But we knew that we weren't paying the highest. And for a long time, I was doing first stage interviews, and one of the things I would say on every single interview was, we can't pay you what other people are going to pay you. Like, don't join us if money is a big motivator. It can't be the motivator. We'll pay you well. We get everything else that comes with flex and all that sort of stuff. But we knew what we could and couldn't offer, and we lent into that and wore that, and we were just open about that as best as we could be, and it worked incredibly well. As well as also just having very tight bands, making sure that we never went outside of those bands for anyone. Like, if they were outside, they weren't hired, and we stuck to that, and that again worked incredibly well for us. So there's things you can do around that imperfection to help solidify it, I think.
Yeah, and I think you're touching on something that's really important that kind of comes hand in hand with pay transparency, is that you have to have a bit more of a focus around pay equity. Talk to me a bit about, where you think that onus, I guess how that onus starts to apply more so from a pay transparent culture perspective, and I guess how companies can start to take steps in that sort of front.
This is harder to unravel the longer you wait. Again, and I say this as someone who's been very lucky because we started from the ground up. We didn't have to unpick a lot of problems with inequity across the team, which again is super, super helpful, but like great that we did that, I suppose. But this is the biggest headache, one of them that we hear when companies sort of are a bit anxious about taking this step, is like, we know we've got employees in teams who are over the theoretical bands that we've got, and we know they're not going to come in, and we know we've also got people under those bands, and if we lift them all up at once, we're going to go bankrupt. So that's one point. I think we're not comp specialists per se. Like we touch on this a lot when we talk to companies, but one thing we're always quite quick to point out to people is you don't have to do everything immediately. Like some really good examples out there from much bigger companies where they've laid out plans to say, we've identified who's underband, who's underpaid. We set a 5-year plan in place to get them back to where they need to be. And that's our commitment publicly to do this. So doing it over 5 years, employee might not be the happiest, but again, you have to do what you have to do and to get back on track. And so not feeling like you have to do it all straight away, I think is important from an equity point of view. Like, you want to at least recognize it, acknowledge it, be public as possible about what you're going to do about it, and then stick to it. You won't please everyone, but you'll please a lot of people, and build some kudos in the process as well.
Yeah, I think the key point there really for me is like, don't let it be something that people have to discover for themselves. Like, everybody talks about pay to co-workers now. I mean, Australia was, I think it was only last year or the year before that the pay secrecy laws were banned or outlawed. But generally across the world, and even if it is outlawed, people are chatting about pay.
Yeah.
So I think the more you could do to front load an effort like implementing pay bands or pay practices and say, look, we recognize that we haven't had structure. And so what's happened is that it's enabled the environment that we have now to exist. We've now introduced structure because we've recognized why we, what we wanted to change and what we wanted to achieve with regard to our culture and our pay practices. What it's highlighted for us is X, and here's how we, intend to resolve it. And I think it just does so much again for building trust, helping people recognize that you understand there's an issue, you're on it. To have that approach versus someone come to you and say, hey, I've just spoken to 4 people who do a similar role to me and we're all paid differently. What's going on here? It's a very different conversation than vice versa.
Yeah, I think the reality is, as much as anyone working for a company wants to be treated well, they also accept that companies aren't perfect. Mistakes are made. It's a really hard thing to get right as well, and people probably don't fully appreciate that until they have to go and see how that's done. But there's a really big difference between proactively taking that to an employee and saying, hey, we've seen this, we know you're not in the right place, and we're going to action it. That's great. They didn't have to tell me that, but that they're going to do something about it, versus not doing anything and then finding out, okay, how long has this been going on and why haven't you done something? Again, first role as a grad before stepping into being a founder, I wasn't overly upset about this, but this is a little bit of a moment for me that I can draw from. Finding out that a colleague of mine was on about £10,000 more base salary than most of us, because he'd negotiated a great talker, basically at interview stage, negotiated a big pay bump coming in, was useless and genuinely should not have been there, and ended up being performance managed out of the business anyway. But we just all sat there when we found out, because you find out, and we sat there thinking, how is he being, why are they paying this person this money? Anyway, as an employee, I've been there, and it is not a great feeling. And it's frustrating, and it erodes trust, and that's what we're trying to fix.
Yeah. And I mean, at the end of the day, pay is there to incentivize. And what does it tell people who are performing when they know their underperforming colleague is being paid 10,000, pounds more than them? Is that being, having a gift of the gab is valuable to the company, but, your performance is less so. And it's incredible, especially when it, results in those outcomes. It's insane, isn't it? Another point, I think, to your point around introducing these practices and just kind of getting ahead of the curve, another one that comes up often for me is people who are suddenly overbanned. What do you tend to be? I think, I'm assuming it's a similar approach here, works well as, transparency is the best sort of course, but what do you tend to recommend for organizations, or how do you see them handling it well when someone is suddenly above this newly installed band, as your, ex-colleague might have been?
Yeah, we, again, equally as hard to resolve, because the reality is you're not going to suddenly go and say, hey, we need to cut your salary by X. That one of the nicest ways I've seen it done, again, gradually over time, is if you are working with this broader pot, as it were, that you can distribute at the end of the year or however you do it, is first identifying who's under and who's over, prioritizing more of a weighting towards those who are under, and capping how much those who are over the band, how much they can earn. So they're still rewarding them. You're still saying, hey, just because you are over band, we're not going to suddenly say you can't have anything. But you're capping how much they can get. So over time, you do it for long enough, you can start to close that gap. And again, in its own way, that's fair as well. It's not their fault necessarily that they're over band. They've got, bills, etc., that they're having to pay, and they're used to that. Suddenly trying to remove salary from them is gonna not particularly be fair on them too. So it's a really hard one. But that's one of the practices I've seen that feels healthy and safe over a long period of time.
Yeah, I would agree. And again, I think having that conversation is the first point, and maybe the second is, what can we do? What's the path forward? Because you're right. No good company would make them cut their pay. So instead, it's what are the avenues available to them? And I think another one is often, how can we talk about progression or promotion? How can we get you to maybe that next pay band, which, is accompanied with a pay increase if that's something that's important to you. So what are the growth steps we can put in place, and how we, ensuring that you don't feel like you're sort of being left behind? Because it could be, I don't think I've ever been in this position where I've had to deliver this news. I've never received it necessarily, but I'd imagine being told you're overpaid isn't a particularly comforting conversation. So,
Yeah, thanks.
being tactful and thoughtful about it. Yeah. When it's like, hang on, I feel like I'm worth this much money. But I think being conscious of how people are feeling in that moment and giving them a path forward rather than just saying we're either not going to give you a pay increase or you're just going to get 1% every year is important.
It's a very delicate conversation because, again, that individual, in some ways, why should they care that, the in their view, I'm performing, I'm doing well, I should get as much of an increase as the next performing person. But again, this is a subject you're never going to please everyone, and you're probably going to please less than half of people as well. People will never be happy with it, but the least you can do is help them understand the decisions and everything that goes behind it, and then at least they have an appreciation of it and the work that goes into it, probably, which definitely helps.
Yeah, I think one of the, rounding this out, I think one of the biggest risks companies face is that people's level of trust in their employer when, pay and pay practices are opaque is just by default low. They just assume that, a company is making decisions that aren't necessarily fair or considered and so on. And so I think, and I mean, I've spoken to people, I've on polls, I've done a lot of work around this, and even HR teams as individuals don't often tend to by default trust that their companies are making the right decisions. So by giving people a logic and a roadmap around how decisions are made, they can at least start to understand where the business is coming from and how they can work within that framework. So I think you're right. Like you'll never find someone who thinks they're overpaid enough. But if people can understand, then that's a really fantastic step towards, building trust and help people understand, why they exist where they do from a pay practice perspective.
Yeah. And I think again, as long as you can there's different ways of fairness. There's internal fairness versus your colleagues. There's external fairness versus market. There's different teams getting paid different things or different percentiles. It's so hard. Which is again, we were able to ground us in owning and wearing what we knew we could do and why we could do it and what our limits were, being open and honest about that, and then saying to potential hires, this is not don't join us if this is going to be a big conversation for you. That sort of helped us actually, and kept it very simple.
Yeah, and I'm sure it does a great job of just helping set expectations from the start, right? We're not wasting anyone's time. You're in here for these reasons versus, just purely pay. So it makes it an important foot to start off on from a new employment relationship, that's for sure. Mate, this has been great. I appreciate it. We've covered a lot of different things: performance, pay transparency, all sorts of, things in between from a transparency perspective. What would be your sort of parting words of advice for companies or heads of people or whoever that are sort of wanting to start out on their transparency journey in whatever realm of the employee experience?
Wow, go speak to Matt. Just it can be a really overwhelming thing to think about, particularly, again, in the space that we're in. If you're a startup, scale-up people team, you're probably a people team of one. You haven't got a total rewards, compensation, benefits team, separate to yours to do all this work. So where do you start? It can be really overwhelming. There's a heap of resources, open source work out there if you go and find it. We're trying to pull it together into an openverse, which is exciting. But lean on peers, lean on network, ask questions, seek help. People are always willing to give it in that startup scale up space, and don't make it bigger than it needs to be. You can break it down to baby steps that will take some time, but you step by step you can get there, and it doesn't have to be rushed, and you shouldn't rush it either. So yeah, not the best advice maybe, but it can be done.
No, I think those are some great tips. I mean, to replug OpenOrg. I mean, you guys, you and John have done some incredible things for the open source movement. I think, don't reinvent the wheel. There's so much incredible work out there that you can, adapt and evolve to meet the needs of your organization, the makeup of your organization. So there's, things that have been viewed 800,000 to 1 million times on your website. So they're obviously helpful. And then there's obviously, as you mentioned, using peers as your community. If people are looking for others that are going through the same journey. And of course, if they're looking to get really educated about it, there's those sorts of pathways for people as well through OpenOrg. So, mate, I appreciate it. Thank you so much for your time, especially this time of night in the UK. Yeah, appreciate it so much.
All good. No, thank you so much for inviting us on, and yeah, it's awesome to connect.
Thanks for joining us on another edition of the Foundation Series. Make sure to head over to our website to subscribe to the Foundation Series for monthly editions featuring future interviews on startup compensation. In each edition, we'll explore the different strategies, trends, and challenges faced by startups around the world. If you have a burning topic you'd like me to cover or a standout guest that you want to hear from, drop me an email so I can dive deeper into the compensation topics that matter most to you. Join me next time as we continue to uncover the strategies and practices driving success in global tech startups around the world. Thanks for listening.